Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're going to be quilting one of our house blocks, and these are some of my favorites. So I can't wait to share with you some tips and tricks for knocking out this block in the most logical way. So let's get started. So here's our house block design that we're going to be working with today, and just in case you're looking for this graph for you to mark your blocks, you can find it in the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com. Okay, so we have got all of these straight lines, and they're going all over the place. We've got diagonals, we've got horizontal lines, we've got more diagonals. They're all over the place, and you really want to take some time to plan this out and how you're going to knock everything out logically. I'm going to show you a good bit of stitching of this block, but I'm going to have to fast forward the video because it's just pretty time consuming to get in here and do everything. What I found after kind of sketching around and making a mess on this thing, I'm going to get started right here after stitching just the center square. This is rectangle in the ditch, and I'm going to get started right here. And that will allow me to knock out these horizontals first, get around this window, knock out this area, then move on to the door, then I'll knock out the roof, at the same time hit that chimney, and then knock out the sunshine rays, work my way down, and then knock out all this ground. So that's kind of my general game plan. Let's get on the machine and see how it works in free motion. So here I'm on the machine, and like I said, I've knocked out just stitching in the ditch around that rectangle, and I'm going to zoom in so that way you can see what I'm doing more clearly. I'm going to be knocking out these straight lines, and the one thing to kind of, just watch, you've got seam allowances, and we're just running right on top of them pretending that they're not there, but those are seams, so there's going to be seam allowances underneath them, and we press that open so it is reduced, but you are going to hit bulk. There is going to be an extra layer of fabric in those areas. So as you stitch into them, just kind of, remind yourself about that. And as you stitch into that, you can hear my machine, as my needle pierces the quilt, it just sounds a little heavier. And just keep that in mind. We're just stitching right on top of them. We're not going to stitch those particular seam lines in the ditch, and that's a-okay. As far as tips for stitching straight lines, like let's say this is the very first block that you've done with this quilt along. Tips for straight lines. I generally bring my hands a little closer to the presser foot, and I also line up the index finger of my right hand with the edge of the presser foot. So I'm basically kind of guiding the fabric in parallel to the needle. And I find that really helps stitch those lines straight as well. However, if you wobble and wiggle, don't worry too much about it. If all of your lines are kind of consistently wobbly and wiggly, no one's going to notice. It's going to look like you meant it to be that way, and that's what's cool. I think this is definitely going to be a neat block to start with. One thing you might be worried about, just seeing how close these lines of stitching are, they are 1/4 of an inch apart, and you might be worried about density. And here's the trick about that. I've mentioned this in several videos, but I'll reiterate it again. Density has less to do with how dense and close together your lines of quilting are. It has more to do with the type of batting that you've chosen. So if you've chosen a nice soft batting that has a good amount of shrink to it, like 100% cotton, then it's going to shrink and shrivel up a little bit after it's all done, no matter how much quilting you put into it, and it's still going to finish as a very soft quilt. Now personally, I like my quilts to finish much flatter than that because I plan to hang this on a wall, and so I use a polyester batting because there's no shrink, it stays flat, the stitches stay very clear and crisp on the surface, and so really it's your batting that will determine the finished look and feel of your quilt than anything else. So you can see me knocking out these lines, just stitching back and forth. And we're going to be finishing up this line, and the next line is when things get a little tricky, because we're going to be stitching the line and hitting some ditches all at the same time. So now let's travel stitch. You notice that I've been rotating every time I have to travel stitch. That's just simply because I'm really trying to stitch this block accurately. It's one of my favorites. I'm going to do a good job on it. Okay, so as I stitch this line, I'm going to hit this ditch on the top of the door, and then stitch down, and then I'll hit the ditch on the top of the window. So I just want to make sure that I'm stitching carefully into that area. Then I get into the ditch. I do find ditching is easier when the seam allowances are pressed open, but even still, it's, you know, pretty noticeable when I pop out because I'm using white thread on top of black fabric. Okay, that's good. And then finish up that line. And here's where I have to kind of look back at my notes to remind myself what I plan to do. I think at this point I plan to stitch in and knock out and just stitch around my window, so I'm going to do that. It's really a good idea to take your time and spend some time practicing tracing the printout, the quilting guide. Spend some time thinking about how you're going to move around the block. It's not a waste of your time to have a little bit more of a game plan in mind. It's not a waste of time at all. Okay, so now I'm just knocking out these ditches, carefully stitching around that window, little window block. I think the reason why I like this so much is it's just cute, you know, it makes me smile to see this house. I'm going to knock out this pane because I won't hit it any other time, and so I just travel stitched up and travel stitched back, and that's a-okay. Notice my travel stitching lines, I wasn't really exactly perfect, so if you do that, if you leave a little space between them, just go back in there and add a little bit more thread, and that'll be good. When in doubt, just add a little bit more thread and you can hide just about anything. Okay, now I'm coming up and around to finish up my ditching around this window. This block is going to be time consuming because there's just so many lines of quilting to hit. It's not, personally, you know, I think if you've practiced straight line free motion quilting before, it's not going to be technically challenging other than just simply consistency, you know, consistently travel stitching, consistently stitching in the ditch. That's really the challenge, but it is time consuming. So I'm going to now knock out and go all the way across. Because I did some back and forth here, I'm probably going to stop here and do some back and forth here, just so that's also consistent. So, you know, half of my window pane isn't going to be darker than the other half. I hope that makes sense. When I say darker, I just really mean the intensity and density of my thread. You can see that kind of balances it out a little bit, makes that window stand out a little bit better. Okay, now I'm going to stitch over. And knock out that little line. So at this point, I'm going to speed up the camera because I'm going to flow through this entire block, and I can't show you all of it in a video unless I have to speed it up because there's just too much to hit. But I want you to see how I work through it. From what I've, you know, kind of estimated and planned, I'm going to knock this out in the most logical way with the least amount of travel stitching. However, there is going to be some as I work up into the roof and come down through these sun rays. So just watch the video and enjoy. Okay, at this point I have filled in almost all of the block. We filled in the roof, the center section of the block, and even this ground section. And now I've got these long lines to stitch, these radiating sun lines. And also I wanted to give you some tips. You might have seen as I was stitching through this roof section, you've got a lot of seam allowance, a lot of bulk in these two areas. You need, we're basically overlapping and stitching through this area, but there are lots of places where these seam allowances are coming together, and you just have to watch out for them. If you see me kind of stop and reposition right in the middle of the line, it's because I'm feeling resistance as I stitch over an area of bulk, and I feel a need to reposition my hands a little bit so I have a better grip on it. But stitching these straight lines, longer straight lines can be more of a challenge just to stay straight through the whole thing. And Josh, watching Josh was kind of instructive. He kind of puts his hand to the back and another hand below, and it's almost a pulling, subtle, I mean this is very subtle, but almost pulling a little bit with his fingertips to the back, and not really pushing but just guiding. This hand's kind of the steerer. And so as you guide it through, that's his way, especially when he's close to the edges of a block. I've noticed that's a hold that he tends to go with, especially when he's on these edges. So that might be helpful as you're stitching these longer lines right here at the edge. Overall, I hope you can see that, yes, this is a time-consuming block. It does require some concentration. Part of the reason why I stop talking and just fast forward is because it allows me to concentrate on what I'm doing better, and I make less mistakes, I find. It is a challenge to try and talk and quilt at the same time. But I'm going to try and finish up this area and kind of talk you through it a little bit better. You can't see them because there's so many, the black on black fabric. Maybe you can see them from this angle a little bit better, but I've got a piecing line here and a piecing line here coming from the sky, and this is the side sections. And so all of this is kind of coming together in this little spot right here. So as I stitch these lines, things might go a little wonky. I'm just going to try and stay on the line as much as possible. I'd say having these lines marked is really important. Because there's so many lines, it's, kind of one of those things that you kind of want to, can I just avoid having to mark all of this? That's one situation where the cheater cloth fabric is a little nicer because you don't have to mark those lines, they're already printed on the fabric. But it's definitely worth it to have these lines marked just so that you can maintain the best accuracy even when you're stitching through these areas that are a little intense and bulky from the piecing. It's not impossible, but it does just require a little bit more focus and concentration. You also can notice how much I'm rotating around quite a lot. Of course, on a big quilt, that's not really going to be open to you as much, especially if you're right smack in the middle of it. But if you're in a block, this is why we work on smaller blocks, simply so it's easier, so you have that ability to rotate and get a good direction. And even in a big quilt, sometimes if I really can't stitch something nicely and I'm having to rip it out because I stitched it really, really off, in that situation I would have to rotate the whole quilt. So never feel like you're learning something and having to unlearn it for stitching something different for a real quilt versus with these little blocks. Skill is skill in my opinion, and I think that no matter how you're doing it, what you're working on, you're gaining skill for free motion. That's really the point. I could even feel the block just kind of slow down and not want to move. So I slowed down my machine and I'm just guiding it through. I ended up with a few big stitches, inconsistent stitches, but I'm not going to worry about it. Back to the center. Another thing you're going to end up with is an area of bulk right here. One thing you might want to do is just not stitch all the way to the corner with your lines. You can kind of stitch up to it and then go on ahead and do the next line. They're all going to kind of cluster together in such a way that you won't be able to tell. Let me just show you what I mean. I'm going to come up to it, but I'm not actually going to hit the previous threads. I'm going to come close, maybe one stitch away, and that's close enough. And then just simply stitch a V as I stitch back down. And that's perfectly fine. That helps you to avoid getting into the area of a lot of bulky threads and potentially breaking thread if your machine doesn't like it. Now, this is a situation I'm already kind of looking at these lines of quilting and trying to figure out how to knock out. I have only 2 lines of quilting left, and this is kind of ironic that this is the way it ended up. I have these 2 lines of quilting left. If I stitch this one, I'll kind of get spat out right at that chimney and have nowhere else to go. So that's got to be my last line. So I think I'm going to stitch this one all the way back to that corner point, stitch along this edge line. This is one of our perimeter lines that we marked, just the 8-inch square line. That'll take me back here, stitch down, and then I can knock out that very last line. Sometimes you'll just have to kind of pull back from your block, take a look at it, and figure out what is the most logical way of knocking it out. Certainly if I had stitched right into that center point, I would have just been kind of locked in there, and I would have had to travel stitch my way out, kind of taking the long road. And having taken a minute to look at it and figure out where I needed to go and how I needed to get there, that saved me some time. So now I'm just going to stitch this perimeter line. I'm taking that hold that Josh uses, my hand to the back pulling, and my other hand, my right hand to the front, guiding. And that's working out really, really well. There we go. Now turn the corner and stitch that last line. Now you notice that I did not hit this perimeter line over here. I think that's okay. I also did not stitch along this edge. So I've got areas where I've stitched along it, but not consistently, not through the whole thing. I think that that's fine. I don't think that you need to go all the way around it again. Unless you want to, of course. But I'm not going to. You probably heard my machine kind of thunk, thunk, thunk as I hit that point. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see I got some big stitches there. As I hit it, my thread and fabric kind of jumped, and you can see I made one big stitch, but hey, it looks fine to me. I'm going to leave it. So that's it for stitching our straight lines in this beautiful house block. This is, bar none, one of my favorite blocks. I love the straight lines. I love how all those angles, just straight lines. We didn't do anything crazy with this, but it's just the direction that you place the line, horizontal, on the diagonal, all radiating from one point, or all stacked together evenly. How you place it creates different effects, and I really hope that you'll take this and run with it with your other quilts. I think it's just so cool to see how something as simple as straight lines can take a very simple piece block and turn it into something really amazing. So I'm tickled to death with it. It is time consuming, so make sure that you have a nice day open where you can concentrate on this block, focus on it, and knock it out. I have shown you pretty much the most logical way of flowing through the block with the least amount of travel stitching. There's a little bit there, but really the least amount of travel stitching possible. And I hope that you'll be able to take this and have fun with it on your own machine. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and join us as we learn how to piece and free motion quilt 42 beautiful blocks together. You can pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt!